The morning Ridge Mercer decided to save a child's life, he was already too late for his own. He didn't know that yet. He was just a man on a machine, 31 degrees and dropping, black leather cutting through a Virginia dawn that smelled like dead leaves and old regret. The kind of morning that doesn't promise anything. The kind of morning that takes. He almost didn't stop. He almost kept riding, the way he'd kept riding past everything that mattered for the last 11 years. Past the courthouse, past the cemetery, past the bedroom door he'd been too drunk to open in time. Almost. But a 5-year-old girl was sitting on a cold curb, alone, watching him, like she'd been waiting her entire short life for something dangerous enough to finally feel safe. Hey, before we go any further, if you've ever felt invisible in a world that moves too fast to notice you, this story was written for you. Stay with me all the way through. I promise you, the ending of this one will wreck you in the best possible way. Drop a like if you're already feeling it, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I've got viewers from all over, and I love knowing where this story is landing. All right, let's ride. The Harley sat outside like a threat. It was a 1998 Road King, black over black, the chrome so scratched and weathered it barely caught the gray morning light anymore. No saddlebags, no decorations, no club patches, no insignia, nothing that said, "Look at me" or "Stay away." Just a machine that had been ridden hard and put away angry, more times than anyone had counted. It sat in the gravel lot of a Shell station on Route 11, engine ticking as it cooled, and it looked exactly like the man who owned it, built for something it no longer did, quieter than it had any right to be, carrying damage nobody could see from the outside. Ridge Mercer stood at the coffee station inside and poured the worst coffee in Shenandoah County into a paper cup. He didn't drink it for the taste. He drank it because it was hot, because it was a reason to stop moving for 4 minutes, and because Sunday mornings had to have something to anchor them, or they became just another long corridor leading nowhere. He was 53 years old, 6'1", 210 pounds, with the kind of face that had once been called handsome by people who were being generous. Now it was just weathered, deep lines around the eyes, a jaw that carried permanent tension, a mouth that had forgotten the architecture of a real smile. His hair was silver gray and kept short in a way that suggested military history, or just a man who'd stopped caring about such things. His hands were the most honest part of him. They were a mechanic's hands, scarred across the knuckles, stained with old grease that never fully washed out, the left thumb missing half a nail from an incident with a torque wrench in 2019 that he'd never had properly looked at. He wore a black thermal under his leather jacket. The jacket was old enough to have its own memories. He'd bought it in 1993 in a parking lot in Roanoke from a man named Decker, who'd needed bus fare to Charlottesville and hadn't asked for anything in return except that Ridge take care of the thing. He had. More or less. The woman behind the counter didn't look up when he paid. He'd been coming in most Sundays for 2 years and she knew what he ordered. The large coffee, sometimes a pack of peanut butter crackers, never anything that required her to actually make anything. And she processed the transaction with the focused efficiency of someone who had long since learned not to engage the quiet men who came in alone on cold mornings. Ridge respected that about her. He didn't engage either. He was on his way out when he almost walked into the little girl. She was standing right inside the door, which explained why the door had felt strange when he pushed, a half-second of resistance before it swung open. And when he stopped himself and looked down, his first thought was purely logistical. Where is her adult? His second thought came from somewhere older and less organized, and it hit him before he had time to stop it. She looks like Sophie. She didn't, really. Sophie had been dark-haired, dark-eyed, with his own stubborn jaw compressed into a child's soft face. This girl was blonde, fine-featured, with enormous gray-green eyes that looked up at him with an expression that wasn't fear exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular watchfulness of a child who has learned to read rooms and read adults very quickly, who measures danger the way other children measure nothing, because they've never had to. She had a purple backpack with a small cartoon cat on it. She was wearing a yellow coat that was slightly too large for her, and rain boots with frogs on them, which seemed optimistic given that it hadn't rained in 4 days. "Your motorcycle is really loud," she said. He stared at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I heard it from the road." "Most people do." She considered this seriously. "Is that on purpose?" "Not anymore." She seemed to accept this as a perfectly reasonable answer. She tilted her head slightly to the left, bird-like, still watching him with those gray-green eyes that were doing more work than any 5-year-old's eyes should have to do. "What's your name?" "Ridge." "That's a weird name." "It is," he agreed. "I'm Avery." He glanced past her, out through the glass door, scanning the lot. There was a dark green Subaru parked at the far pump, and a man standing with his back to the store, watching the numbers on the pump display with his arms folded. He was tall, well-dressed for a Sunday morning, pressed khakis, a quarter zip the color of oatmeal. Even from here, from the back, Ridge could see something careful and deliberate in the way he stood, the posture of a man performing composure. "You with him?" Ridge asked, gesturing. Avery looked. Her expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind it. A small and rapid internal adjustment, the kind children make when they've learned that certain questions need certain answers. "That's my dad," she said. "He know you're in here?" A beat, just a half-second too long. "I asked to get a snack." Ridge looked at her hands. No snack. He looked back at her face. She was watching the man at the pump through the glass with an attention that wasn't love and wasn't comfort. It was surveillance. The kind of watching you do when you need to know where someone is at all times. "Your dad's name?" Ridge asked. "Martin," she said. Then, immediately with a child's precise instinct for oversharing the wrong detail, "He doesn't like it when I talk to strangers." "He's right," Ridge said. She looked up at him. "Are you a stranger?" "Yes." "You don't feel like one," she said. And then the door opened and a woman came in, the wife, presumably, and the moment collapsed. The woman was blonde, mid-30s, attractive in a planned and careful way. She had the kind of smile that appeared fully formed, as if she kept it on a hook near the door. It landed on Ridge for exactly 1 second, assessing, categorizing, dismissing, and then dropped to Avery. "There you are," she said, and her voice was warm and her hand on Avery's shoulder looked gentle, and Ridge was almost fooled. Almost. Because Avery's entire body had responded to that hand, not with relaxation, not with the instinctive lean of a child toward a parent, but with a subtle, practiced stillness. The stillness of containment. The stillness of a small animal that has learned that sudden movements invite consequences. Ridge paid attention to things like that. It was one of the few useful leftovers from his previous life. "Sorry if she was bothering you," the woman said to him. Her name was, he would learn later, Diane. Diane Marsh, née Calloway, transplant from Northern Virginia, member of the Calverton County PTA for 3 years running. "She wasn't," Ridge said. He held the door for them. Avery went through first, and as she passed him, her sleeve rode up just slightly, the cuff of the yellow coat sliding back as she reached to push the door wider. And Ridge saw the bruise on the inside of her left forearm. Not a small bruise, not the kind a child gets from bumping into furniture or falling off a bike. It was a gripping bruise, a cluster of pressure marks, each one a distinct oval, distributed in a pattern that Ridge had seen before and hadn't been able to forget since. He said nothing. He walked to his bike, started it, and sat there for a long moment in the idling cold while the Subaru pulled out of the lot and turned north onto Route 11. He watched it until it crested the hill and disappeared. He drank the rest of his terrible coffee. He looked at the space where the car had been. Then he rode home and didn't sleep. The shop was called Mercer Motorsports, which was an ambitious name for what it actually was. A converted 2-car garage at the end of a gravel driveway, with a single lift, a parts wall that took up the entire east side, and a hand-painted sign that had been weathering on the exterior for 9 years. Ridge lived in the apartment above it, which he'd finished himself after buying the property, insulated the walls himself, ran the plumbing himself, built the kitchen cabinets from reclaimed pine he'd salvaged from a barn 2 counties over. The result was functional and austere and entirely without warmth, and he'd been aware of that and not done anything about it, because warmth required intention, and intention required believing you deserved the result. The shop had a small reputation for honest work and longer wait times. Ridge was meticulous, and meticulous took time. He didn't advertise. Customers came from recommendations, and his appointments were usually booked 3 to 4 weeks out, which gave him enough income to sustain the life he'd constructed. The narrow, careful life. The one where he went to the store on Sundays, ate his meals at the workbench or standing at the kitchen window, and had no conversations longer than necessary. He had one friend, sort of, a man named Cass Whitmore who ran the auto parts store in town and had been trying for 4 years to get Ridge to come to his wife's birthday dinners, and who Ridge kept almost agreeing to and then finding reasons not to. That Sunday night, Ridge sat on the edge of his bed with the lights off and the window cracked and listened to the wind come down off the mountain and tried to remember the last time he'd intervened in something that wasn't his business. He remembered it clearly. It had been 11 years ago, and it had gone catastrophically. His daughter Sophie had been 7 when her mother, Ridge's ex-wife Claire, had started seeing a man named Gary Pruitt who managed a chain of hardware stores and coached rec league soccer and had never, in any public context, given anyone reason to look twice. Ridge had had reasons to look twice. He'd said so. He'd said so loudly and badly, and at the wrong times in the wrong places, drunk twice and sober once. And the result had been a restraining order that kept him 300 yards from Claire's house and, by extension, from Sophie. He'd tried the legal route. He'd documented. He'd filed. The family court system in his county had been overworked, understaffed, and had found Claire's presentation of a stable home with a contributing partner more compelling than a former club enforcer's unsubstantiated concerns. And the word unsubstantiated had done something to Ridge that he'd never quite recovered from. Because he'd known. He'd known with everything in him that he'd known. And then, 14 months into the restraining order, Gary Pruitt had gone too far, and Sophie had ended up in the hospital with a dislocated shoulder and a story that changed 3 times under questioning. She'd healed. She was 16 now and lived with Claire in Roanoke and wanted nothing to do with Ridge, which he understood and accepted, and which destroyed him on a rotating basis. She was alive and she was okay, and she had reasons for the distance, and he carried all of that the way he carried everything. In the body, in the hands, in the permanent tension along his jaw. He knew what gripping bruises looked like on a small arm. He knew what a child looked like when they'd learned to track an adult's location at all times. He lay down on top of the covers without taking his boots off and stared at the ceiling until it was light again. He went back the next Sunday. He told himself it was coincidence. He always got coffee on Sunday. The Shell station was on his route. This wasn't deviation. He was aware that he was lying to himself with impressive coherence, and he didn't stop. The Subaru was already there when he pulled in. He parked on the opposite side of the lot, further from the pumps, and went inside with the deliberateness of a man who definitely had no purpose here. He poured his coffee. He looked at the racks of chips and crackers without seeing them. Avery was sitting on the curb outside the store's side entrance, not the front, the side, where there was a small concrete step that faced the edge of the lot rather than the road. She had a box of crayons in her lap and a sheet of white paper on top of the box, and she was drawing with the focused seriousness of someone who considers art a form of documentation rather than entertainment. Ridge came out the side door with his coffee. She looked up immediately. "You came back," she said. "I get coffee on Sundays," he said. She looked at him with the gray-green eyes. "Every Sunday?" "Most." "Me too," she said. "I always come to the store on Sundays." A pause. "I wait by this door because Martin doesn't like the cold," and Diane looks at her phone. She stated this without effect, the way a person states a navigational fact. Ridge sat down on the concrete step beside her. He told himself this was because his knee was aching, which was also true. He looked at what she was drawing. It was a motorcycle. Not bad for a 5-year-old. She'd gotten the general shape right, the wheel proportions, something that approximated handlebars. "Is that mine?" he asked. "I've been practicing," she said seriously. "I couldn't remember the mirror part." She pointed to a small rectangle she'd added to the left side. "Is that right?" "Close enough," he said. She drew in silence for a moment. Then, "Did you know motorcycles are dangerous?" "Yes." "Diane says only people who don't care about living ride motorcycles." He thought about that. "Some people who care very much about living ride motorcycles," he said carefully, "because it reminds them that they're still here." Avery absorbed this with the gravity of a small philosopher. She drew a figure beside the motorcycle, a stick figure with a wide, angular shape around it that he realized was meant to be a leather jacket. "That's you," she said. "I figured." She drew a smaller figure next to the larger one, a tiny stick figure with what appeared to be a ponytail and a backpack. She colored the backpack purple with meticulous care. "Is that you?" he asked. "I'm just standing there," she said. "I'm not on the motorcycle. I know not to get on without a helmet." "Smart," he said. She looked up at him sideways. "Would you ever let someone ride with you if they had a helmet?" "Depends on the person." "What would they have to be like?" He looked out at the parking lot, at the gray Virginia morning, at the bare trees along the ridge to the east. "Brave," he said finally. "And honest." She nodded very seriously and went back to her drawing, and Ridge drank his terrible coffee in the company of a 5-year-old he didn't know on a concrete step in a gas station parking lot, and something in his chest, something that had been sealed tight for 11 years, shifted almost imperceptibly, the way old wood shifts in a change of weather, not breaking, just adjusting, just acknowledging that the conditions had changed. He noticed, as he stood to leave 15 minutes later, that she had her left arm angled slightly away from him. Not obviously, not in a way a child that age would consciously plan, but habitual. The way you protect something without meaning to, the way the body learns to root around its own damage. He didn't say anything. He said goodbye and walked to his bike and sat for a moment before starting the engine, and he thought about what she'd said. "You don't feel like a stranger." He thought about how quickly children make those determinations, and what it said about the alternatives she'd been given, that a scarred man on a loud motorcycle felt like safety. He started the engine and rode north, and the cold came at him like a judgment, and he let it. The third Sunday, she brought him a drawing she'd done during the week. She presented it from her purple backpack with the solemnity of someone delivering important documents. It was on construction paper, red, and it showed the motorcycle from the previous week's drawing, but now it had additions, wings, which she'd drawn in careful, deliberate arcs on either side of the back wheel. The stick figure rider was there, still wearing the angular leather jacket, and now the stick figure Avery was on the back of the motorcycle, holding on. "We have helmets," she said, pointing to 2 small circles she'd added to the figures' heads. "Yours is black. Mine is purple." He looked at the drawing for a long moment. "Wings," he said. "So it can fly over the bad parts," she said simply. He folded the drawing carefully and put it in his inside jacket pocket, and something about the way he did it, slowly, deliberately, treating it like it mattered, made her watch him with an expression he couldn't name and didn't try to. "Avery," he said. "Yeah." "Does anything hurt?" He kept his voice flat, neutral. The question designed to sound casual enough that it wouldn't alarm her. She was quiet for a moment. A 5-year-old's quiet is usually brief and impulsive. This one was measured. "My arm was sore," she said, still looking at her crayons. "Last week. I fell." He didn't push. He knew better than to push. "Falls are the worst," he said. "Yeah." She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "I'm going to draw you a house next week," she announced, with the deliberate subject change of a child who has learned, very young, to redirect. He didn't say, "What kind of house do you live in?" He said, "I'll look forward to that." And he did. And that was when he understood that he was in something now, and there was no clean way back out of it. On the 4th Sunday, she didn't come. He sat on the step for 40 minutes, drinking coffee that went cold, watching the lot. The Subaru wasn't there. After 20 minutes, Martin Marsh pulled in alone. No Diane, no Avery, and went inside and came out with a 6-pack of sparkling water and got in the car without looking at anything and left. Ridge watched him go with the stillness of a man who has learned that observation is a form of preparation. He went home. He pulled out the drawing with the wings and looked at it for a long time, and then he put it on the workbench under a clean rag because he didn't want grease on it. The 5th Sunday, she was back, and he knew the moment he saw her that something had happened in the intervening week because she was moving differently, smaller, more compressed, like a child trying to take up less space than her actual body required. She'd perfected this to an impressive and heartbreaking degree. Her left arm was in a long-sleeved shirt under her coat, and when she pulled out her crayons, she used her right hand almost exclusively. He said nothing about any of it. He sat down on the step, and she showed him 3 drawings she'd done during the week. The first was the house. She'd promised him a house, and she'd delivered. A large 2-story structure with many windows, all of which she'd drawn with the curtains closed. A fence, a gate that was closed. The door was very small relative to the house. The second drawing was a bedroom. Her bedroom, she said, with a bed and a window and a rug with stars on it. And a lock. She'd drawn a lock on the outside of the bedroom door. He registered this. He did not react to it. The third drawing was darker in tone and harder to interpret. She called it the basement and declined to add anything further, and she put it back in her backpack quickly, with the care of someone managing classified information. Ridge looked at the Shell station side wall and breathed slowly through his nose and chose the thing that he knew was the right choice, which was to ask about the motorcycle drawing she'd been doing. "I drew more bikes," she said, visibly relieved by the subject change. "I finally got the exhaust pipe right. I looked it up." "You looked it up," he repeated. "On Diane's tablet. She was asleep. I searched Harley-Davidson exhaust and looked at pictures." She said this with complete guilelessness. "Diane doesn't know. She doesn't really check what I search." Something about this detail landed wrong and stayed wrong. The detail not of the searching, but of the Diane doesn't know. The practiced covertness of it. The ease. "How old are you, Avery?" 5 3/4, she said, with the dignity appropriate to that precise measurement. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He was quiet for a moment, and she was quiet too, and the morning settled around them like it was theirs. "Do you have any friends?" she asked then, with the directness that 5-year-olds deploy without understanding what the question costs. "Not many," he said. "Me either," she said. She didn't say it sadly. She said it as a fact, the way you report your height. "Martin says I talk too much. Diane says I make things up." He looked at her. She was coloring in a wheel with careful circular strokes. "Do you?" he asked. She looked up at him, those gray-green eyes doing all that work. "Make things up?" "Yeah." She thought about this seriously. "No," she said. "I just say what I see." A pause. Some people don't like that. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the bare tree line and the gray November sky and the crows circling something at the field's edge across the road. Then he said, "No, some people don't." She nodded and went back to her coloring, and Ridge sat with the weight of what he was accumulating. Sunday by Sunday, drawing by drawing, detail by detail, and understood that he was building something, though he couldn't yet say whether it was a case or a penance or just the particular shape that the rest of his life was going to take. The 6th Sunday, she told him about the locked door. Not directly. She didn't announce it. She was in the middle of telling him about a television show she'd watched. Something animated, something with a talking dog. And then suddenly, in the seamless way a child's narrative shifts register, she was talking about her room and how quiet it got at night, and how she'd started putting her drawings under her mattress because the mattress was heavy and the door to her room locked from the outside, and she couldn't get out after 8 o'clock anyway, so it was the safest place. He didn't move. He kept his face still and his breathing even, and he let her talk. She described, without drama or complaint, sleeping with her crayons under her pillow because she'd found that if she left them on the desk, sometimes they weren't there in the morning. She described drinking from the bathroom tap at night when she was thirsty, because she wasn't supposed to come downstairs after 8, and the noise of the pipes scared her a little, but not as much as the other noises. She described drawing by the light from the window because the overhead light had a switch outside the door. She described all of this in the same mild documentary tone she used to describe everything, and Ridge sat beside her on the cold concrete step and listened with his whole body, not just his ears, but his hands, which were very still in his lap, and his jaw, which was clenched without expression, and his chest, which was doing something complicated and old. When she finished, she looked up at him with the gray-green eyes. "Do you have a room?" she asked. "I have an apartment," he said, "above my shop." "Is there a lock?" "On the outside door. But not—" She stopped. She seemed to hear herself, to measure the implication. She went back to her drawing. "Avery," he said. "Yeah." "I'm glad you told me about the motorcycle show." She looked up. Something in her small face shifted. A brief, complicated flicker, like weather passing over open water. She understood that he hadn't said what he'd actually said. She understood that he was holding it carefully, keeping it safe, not using it in front of her. She was 5 3/4, and she understood this perfectly, and the fact that she did was the most devastating thing Ridge had encountered in a very long time. "Okay," she said. "See you next week," he said. "See you next week," she said. He walked to his bike. He did not start it immediately. He sat with his hands on the handlebars and looked at the gray sky going darker over the ridge, and breathed through his nose 4 counts, out through his mouth 4 counts. The thing he'd learned from a VA counselor in 2015 who'd been trying to help him with the PTSD he'd refused to officially acknowledge. And then he started the engine. He drove to the county office of Child Services. They were closed on Sunday. He drove back home. He sat in the shop with the lights on and the radio off, and looked at the drawing with the wings, which was still under the clean rag on the workbench. He took it out. He held it in his grease-stained hands, this piece of red construction paper with a motorcycle that could fly over the bad parts. And he thought about what he was going to do. He thought about what had happened the last time he'd tried to protect a child through official channels. He thought about the word unsubstantiated. He thought about Sophie's dislocated shoulder and the story that changed 3 times. And he thought about a 5-year-old who hid her crayons under the mattress and drew the lock on the outside of her door with careful, accurate detail, because she drew what she saw. Monday morning, he called the county. He gave his name. He described what he'd observed, the bruising, the behavioral indicators, the statements about the room and the door, and the nighttime isolation. He was calm and specific and used clinical language where he could, language borrowed from things he'd read after Sophie's hospitalization, language designed to sound credible coming from a man who looked like him. The woman on the phone took notes. She was professional and measured and said all the right things about follow-up timelines and anonymous reports and his option to remain unnamed. She did not sound alarmed. She sounded like someone processing the 14th call of the morning, doing her job in a system that had more volume than it had capacity. He gave his number. He hung up. He did not hear back for 11 days. When they did call back, it was to inform him that an assessment had been conducted and that the family had been found to be in compliance with required standards of care, and that if he had additional concerns or new information, he should feel free to call again. Ridge held the phone against his ear for a long moment after the call ended, listening to dead air. Then he set the phone down on the workbench and picked up a wrench and went back to work, because there was nothing else to do yet. And the discipline of working with his hands was the only thing that kept the older, louder version of himself from making decisions that the current version was trying very hard not to make. Outside, the wind came down off the mountain. The temperature was dropping. Somewhere north on Route 11, a little girl with gray-green eyes was locked in a room after 8 o'clock, drawing motorcycles by the light from her window, hiding her crayons under her mattress, sleeping with the drawing she'd promised herself she'd finish. He didn't know what the Marsh house looked like. He didn't know what it sounded like at night. He didn't know yet what Avery's full name was, or how long she'd been there, or who she'd been before she'd learned to hide her crayons and track adults across rooms and redirect questions with a 5-year-old's accomplished precision. But he knew what a locked door meant when it was on the outside. He knew what a gripping bruise meant. He knew what it meant when a child said Diane doesn't know with that particular fluency. Not the secrecy of mischief, but the secrecy of survival. And he knew, with the marrow-deep certainty of a man who has already failed this particular test once and has spent 11 years trying to understand exactly how, that the system he'd just called would not move fast enough. He needed something else. He needed someone who knew how to build a case that couldn't be dismissed, documented in a way that left no room for the word unsubstantiated. Someone with credibility, with clinical knowledge, with the kind of history that made investigators listen. He needed someone who'd seen this before, in the body, in the bone. The problem was, he'd spent 11 years making sure he had no one. The wind rattled the shop door. Ridge stared at the wall of parts and tools and sorted inventory and thought about Evelyn Hart, who he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, who had left a voicemail he'd never returned, who lived 20 minutes east on a dirt road and who had, during her 32 years as a pediatric nurse, seen things she couldn't stop seeing. He thought about whether he had the right to walk back into someone's life carrying damage this serious, asking for this much. He thought about a red piece of construction paper with a motorcycle that had wings. He reached for his phone. Evelyn Hart's porch light was on. That was the first thing Ridge noticed as he turned off the county road onto her gravel drive, the light burning yellow in the early dark, the way it always had, the way he remembered it from the years when he'd had reasons to know what her porch looked like. It was a small house set back from the road behind a windbreak of white pines that had grown another 5 or 6 feet since the last time he'd been here. The driveway was a quarter-mile long, and his headlight swept the tree trunks as he came through, casting long shadows that leaped and fell, and the whole approach felt like something he should have done 3 years ago and hadn't. He killed the engine 20 feet from the porch and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The cold settled immediately. The particular cold of a November night in the valley. The kind that comes up from the ground as much as it comes down from the sky, damp and patient. He could hear water moving somewhere, the creek that ran along the back of her property. He could hear the pines. He could not talk himself into getting off the bike. He got off the bike anyway. Her door opened before he reached the steps, and Evelyn Hart stood in the frame with a mug of something hot and an expression that said she was not surprised and was also not particularly pleased. She was 67, small and lean in a way that suggested efficiency rather than deprivation. A woman who moved precisely and wasted nothing, not motion, not words, not the particular quality of attention she gave to whatever she was looking at. Her hair was white and kept in a short, practical cut. She had eyes the color of weathered pewter, and they were doing to Ridge now what they had always done to him, looking past the surface presentation directly into the structural integrity of what was underneath. "You called first," she said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a greeting either. 30 minutes ago, he said. "I know, I picked up." "I know you picked up." She looked at him for another second, assessing, measuring, running some internal calculation that he'd never been able to read clearly. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "You look like hell." "I've looked like hell for years." "This is a specific kind of hell," she said. "Come in." Her kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee and something herbal, dried things hanging from the rack above the window, lavender and rosemary and other plants he couldn't name. There was a table with 4 chairs, 2 of which had stacks of books on them. The walls had framed photographs, not of family, primarily, but of landscapes and a few of the kind of documentary-style images that nurses who've spent 30 years in pediatric wards sometimes collect. Images of children who are whole and safe and laughing, kept visible as a counterweight. He sat at the table in the chair she indicated. She brought coffee without asking if he wanted any, which he did, and sat across from him with her own mug. She waited. He told her. He started with the first Sunday and went through all of them. The bruise, the drawings, the locked door, the behavioral patterns, the county call, the response. He told it in order and without embellishment, the way you give a report. And she listened the way she'd always listened, without interrupting, without reacting visibly, with the focused stillness of a woman who has spent decades learning how to receive terrible information without flinching. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the sounds of the house settling in the cold. "How old?" she asked. 5. 5 3/4, she'd say. "Adopted." That's what she said. "He's her dad." "I don't know the full picture yet." "The bruise placement." She said it flat, clinical. "You said inside of the forearm, multiple pressure points. 4 distinct marks, maybe 5. Consistent with a grip." She looked at her mug. "And the door locks from the outside." She described it clearly, drew it clearly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the most recent drawing he'd taken. Avery had given him another one 2 Sundays ago. A drawing of what was labeled my room with the door featured prominently, the lock visible as a rectangle on the exterior frame. He put it on the table. Evelyn looked at it for a long time. She didn't touch it. "You called the county," she said. "They assessed, found compliance." "Of course they did." She said it without bitterness, just as observation. the particular tonelessness of someone who has been here before and knows the geography of this disappointment. What are these people like in town? I don't know them well. From what I've heard, respected. He works in financial management, something regional. She's involved in school programs, charitable appearances, church going. From what I understand, she looked at the drawing again. The family that presents as most exemplary, she said slowly, is the family that's had the most practice. She pushed the drawing back toward him. What do you want from me, Ridge? He looked at her. Documentation. I need someone who can look at what I've collected and tell me what it means in clinical language. Someone who can help me build something that a second assessment can't dismiss. You need a case. I need a case. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in a long, slow sound like breathing. You understand what this requires, she said. It requires time, careful time. You can't rush it, and you can't blow it, because if you blow it, they know they're being watched, and they adjust, and suddenly there's nothing visible, and that child goes somewhere you can't find her. I know. Do you? She looked at him directly. Because the last time you tried to protect a child, you went through every official channel, and it still wasn't fast enough. And I'm asking whether you've made peace with slow, because slow is what this requires. The words landed the way she'd intended them to. Accurate and unkind in the way that accurate things sometimes are. He held them. I haven't made peace with anything, he said, but I understand slow. I'll do slow. She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her mug, drank, set it down. There's a woman named Carol Voss who works with the state's Regional Child Advocacy Office in Harrisonburg. She's not in the county system. She works at a different tier. If you build something solid enough, I can get it to her directly. She doesn't need a county referral. She just needs evidence she can use. How solid is solid enough? Pattern documentation, medical observation, behavioral records, the drawings. Evelyn glanced at the one on the table. And you need corroboration, not just your word. You're a man with no professional credentials and a restraining order in your past. And the first thing anyone's going to find when they look at you is that you couldn't protect your own daughter. The sentence was surgical, and she'd known it would be, and she'd said it anyway because she needed to know if he could take it without breaking or bolting. He took it. I know what they'll find, he said. So you need someone else on the record, someone with standing. She put her hand flat on the table. I have standing, but if I put my name on this, I need to believe in it completely. I need to see what you've seen. I can arrange that. Not arranged, organic. You can't manufacture an encounter with a child you're trying to protect without contaminating what you're building. He thought. She's there every Sunday, same location. Her parents let her sit outside while they shop. It's been consistent for 6 weeks. Evelyn looked at him. You've been going back for 6 weeks. Yes. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite softening, more like recalibration. All right, she said finally. Next Sunday. I'll be there for coffee. She stood up and carried both mugs to the sink. You should know, she said, her back to him, that if this is what I think it is, it's going to take weeks, maybe months. And somewhere in that time, you're going to see something that makes you want to do it the other way. He knew what the other way was. He didn't need it defined. The other way didn't work for Sophie, he said. No, she said. It didn't. She turned around. You need to sleep. You look like you've been awake for 4 days. 2. Go home. He stood. He zipped his jacket. He picked up the drawing from the table. She watched him move toward the door and then said, without particular inflection, Ridge. He stopped. The fact that she talks to you, Evelyn said. The fact that she gives you the drawings. That's not random. Children in her situation don't extend trust without reason. They've usually learned through painful repetition that trust is a liability. She paused. She's extending it anyway. You understand what that means. He understood. He didn't trust himself to say anything about it. He went out into the cold and started the bike and drove home through the dark, and the pines behind him disappeared into the night, and the creek sound followed him further than it should have before the wind swallowed it. The following Sunday arrived the way November Sundays do in that part of Virginia. Gray and absolute, the sky the color of old pewter, the cold announcing itself without apology. Ridge got to the Shell station 20 minutes early. Evelyn's truck, a 10-year-old gray Tacoma with a cracked rear bumper she'd never had repaired, was already in the far end of the lot when he pulled in, which meant she'd been there longer. He went inside. She was at the coffee station, which she'd chosen because it had a clear sight line to the side entrance, where Avery's concrete step was. She handed him a cup as he came up beside her without looking at him directly. "Subaru?" she said quietly. "Not here yet. Usually comes in the next 10 minutes. "Good coffee," she said, which meant the coffee was not good and she was calibrating her expectations of the morning's rewards. She moved to the far end of the counter and appeared to examine a rotating display of local honey while actually positioning herself with an unobstructed view of the door and the side window. Ridge paid for his coffee and stood near the magazine rack and waited. The Subaru pulled in at 9:17. Martin Marsh got out first, tall, the oatmeal quarter zip replaced today, with a fleece vest over a button-down, the kind of outfit that said outdoor lifestyle, moderate income, responsible citizen. He was conventionally handsome in the way of men who've maintained their appearance as a form of control. Trimmed beard, good posture, the careful presentation of a man who understands the value of first impressions. He went around to this passenger side and opened it for Diane, who emerged in a long parka with her hair down, and the gesture was the gesture of a courteous husband, and it was seamless enough that you'd have to be looking for the seam to find it. Then the rear door opened and Avery got out. She was wearing the yellow coat again and her purple backpack and the frog rain boots despite the absence of rain. Her hair was in two uneven braids that suggested she'd done them herself, and she had her crayon box already clutched against her chest. She scanned the lot in a single practice sweep. Not the way a child looks around, curious and random, but the directional, systematic scan of someone checking exits and positions. Ridge clocked it. He watched Evelyn clock it too, from the corner of the store, her hand still on a jar of honey she had no intention of buying. Martin said something to Avery with a smile. She nodded. The smile she returned was correct in its dimensions and wrong in its depth, the way a photocopy is wrong but the shape is right, but the original isn't there. They came in. Martin held the door. Avery went through first, and as she did, she looked up and saw Ridge, and what happened on her face was not performed or calculated. It was immediate and involuntary, the particular brightness of a child who has sighted something genuinely good in a landscape that doesn't contain enough of it. "You're here," she said. "I'm here," he said. Martin Marsh's attention moved to Ridge with the speed and focus of a man who monitors his environment carefully. The smile that appeared was practiced and warm. "Hey there," he said. "You know Avery?" "We've talked a few times," Ridge said. "She likes the motorcycle." "All kids do," Martin said, which was meant to diminish the specific thing between Ridge and Avery into a generic and therefore manageable category. His eyes were doing something his mouth wasn't, taking Ridge apart with a thoroughness that was invisible if you weren't watching for it. "Martin Marsh," he said, and extended his hand. Ridge shook it. "Ridge Mercer. You local?" "Shop on Route 11. Motorcycles." "Ah." Something settled in Martin's face. A small recalibration. A mechanic was a legible type. Legible types were easier to dismiss. "Well, she talks about motorcycles constantly," he said, with the tone of a man sharing a manageable quirk, and put his hand on Avery's shoulder in a light grip. Ridge watched Avery's body do the same thing it always did. That contained stillness, that small, precise accommodation. Diane materialized at Martin's side. "Hi," she said, with the assembled smile. "I'm Diane. Are you a friend of the family?" "No," Ridge said. A beat. "Ah," she said, and the smile adjusted without disappearing, and Ridge could see that she was doing what Martin had done, categorizing, filing, assessing threat level. "Avery," Diane said, "go pick a snack, baby." Avery went, with a backward look at Ridge that contained more communication than most adults managed with full sentences. Martin and Diane moved toward the back of the store. Ridge got his coffee. Evelyn materialized at his shoulder with the calm nonchalance of a woman who had spent decades moving through pediatric wards without disturbing the air. "I saw," she said quietly. "The shoulder. The shoulder. The scan when she got out of the car. The recovery time between the smile and the real expression." She paused. "She's been doing this a long time." He nodded. "How's the left arm today?" He checked. Long sleeves again, but when Avery had reached for her crayons in the backpack, there'd been a momentary exposure at the wrist, a fading yellow-green at the edge of what had been a bruise. "Healing," he said quietly. "Old one." "New ones will come," Evelyn said without effect. This was not callousness. It was the clinical acknowledgement of a pattern, said in a way that didn't grant it permission but named it accurately. She paid for her coffee. "I want to see the drawings." He had them in his inside pocket, 4 of them, the ones Avery had given him over the past weeks. He didn't take them out here. They went out the front door while the Marshes were at the back of the store, and stood at the edge of the lot with their backs to the building, and he passed Evelyn the drawings one at a time. She looked at each one for a long time. The motorcycle with wings, the house with the closed curtains and the closed gate, the bedroom with the exterior lock, the basement drawing, which Avery had eventually given him last week after holding it in her backpack for 2 weeks. A dark, irregular shape filled with a color that was brown-gray, the mixed result of using many crayons on the same area, and in the center of the shape a smaller shape that might have been a chair. Evelyn held the basement drawing for a full 30 seconds. "Has she described the basement to you directly?" she asked. "Not directly. She named the drawing, that's all." Evelyn handed the drawings back. Her face was composed, but there was something moving underneath it that her professional discipline kept from the surface. "The lock on the bedroom door," she said. "That alone, documented and corroborated, is significant. The chair in that space—" She stopped. "We need more. We need enough that there's no question, because they present well. I've dealt with families like this. They're the hardest cases because the presentation is their primary protection. What do we need? I want to observe her for 3 more Sundays. With you, naturally, because she's comfortable with you, and the behavior I see in that context will be her genuine baseline. I'll take notes each time, clinical observations, behavioral indicators. I have a written format I've developed over the years that reads in a way that investigators understand." She looked toward the side of the building where Avery's step was. "After 3 more Sundays, I want to talk to Carol Voss informally. Tell her what we're seeing. Get her read on how strong the documentation needs to be before she'll act." 3 weeks, Ridge said. "I know that sounds long." "She's in that house every night." Evelyn looked at him with her pewter eyes. "I know she is," she said, "and I know what that costs you to sit with. But a compromise case doesn't help her. A successful case gets her out permanently and puts those people somewhere they can't do this to another child. You have to be able to want both." He breathed through his nose. The cold air had a bite to it. Across the lot, a crow settled on the dumpster enclosure and watched them with the alert lateral suspicion of its kind. 3 weeks, he said, "starting today." They went back inside separately. Ridge got a second cup of coffee he didn't need and went out the side door to Avery's step. She was already there. She had a bag of peanut butter crackers and her crayons, and she'd spread 3 sheets of paper on the concrete step beside her, weighted with her crayon box. She was working on what appeared to be a very detailed rendering of the Road King from a 3/4 front angle, and it was, Ridge noted with genuine surprise, technically better than most of her previous work. "You've been practicing," he said. "Every day," she said without looking up. I looked at more pictures. Diane's tablet again. She still doesn't check. He sat down. He cracked his coffee cup. Evelyn came around the corner of the building 2 minutes later with her own coffee and a packet of crackers, and sat on the far end of the step with the natural ease of a woman who has never been anywhere she didn't belong. And Ridge said, "Avery, this is Evelyn. She gets coffee here too sometimes." Avery looked up. She looked at Evelyn with the measuring attention she gave everyone, and Evelyn looked back at her with the steady, uncrowding kind of presence that was her particular gift. Not performing warmth, not angling for it, just being simply and non-threateningly present. "Hi," Avery said. "Hi," Evelyn said. "That's a good drawing." The exhaust is still wrong, Avery said, and went back to it. Evelyn caught Ridge's eye over the child's bent head. She said nothing. She didn't need to. What they were both watching, the way Avery's pencil moved with such intense focus, the way her thin shoulders hunched slightly over the paper as though protecting it, the way she ate the crackers without really registering she was eating, her attention absorbed entirely in the work she was doing. All of it was being received and registered and would be written down tonight, precise and clinical and damning in the way that truth, documented carefully, eventually becomes. 3 Sundays. They kept their word. Evelyn's notes accumulated in a wire-bound notebook that she kept in the locked glove box of the Tacoma, and Ridge drove to her house twice during that period to sit at her kitchen table and go over what they had. She read to him from the notebook in the measured cadence of a woman who had written medical reports for 3 decades, behavioral indicators consistent with chronic trauma response, hypervigilance markers, trauma-informed avoidance behaviors, the specific pattern of disclosure and withdrawal that children in ongoing abusive situations exhibit, the drawings, cataloged with dates and descriptions, the observed responses to parental contact. On the second Sunday of the 3, something happened that wasn't in any plan. Martin Marsh came around the side of the building. Ridge saw him first. He was 20 feet away before Ridge clocked him coming, had come out the side door instead of the front, carrying a bottle of water, and now he stopped when he saw Ridge and Evelyn and Avery arranged on the step. The stop was very brief. The recovery was very fast. But in that half-second of adjustment, Ridge caught the look that crossed Martin Marsh's face before the composed mask reassembled. It wasn't anger, it was something colder and more calculated than anger. It was assessment. "Avery," Martin said pleasantly, "we're heading out in a few minutes." "Okay," Avery said. She kept drawing. Martin looked at Evelyn. "Don't think we've met. I'm Martin." "Evelyn," she said, and shook his hand with the matter-of-fact steadiness of a woman who has shaken the hands of people who frightened her and never let them see it. "You and Ridge know each other?" "Old friends," she said. Martin nodded. He looked at the papers on the step, the drawings, Avery's work spread out. Something moved behind his eyes. Then he looked at Avery. "Make sure you clean up before you come in," he said, and his voice was warm and his eyes were not, and he went back around the building. Evelyn waited 30 seconds. Then she said to Ridge, very quietly, he counted the drawings. Ridge had seen it too, the precise second of inventory that Martin's eyes had done before looking away. "Avery," Ridge said, keeping his voice even, "do you want to keep a couple of those at home or take them all with you today?" She looked up. She looked at the drawings, then at her backpack, then at the corner of the building where her father had disappeared. Something moved through her expression quickly, the particular rapid calculation of a child who has learned to run scenarios. "I'll take them," she said, and began folding them carefully, her small hands working with a precision that looked like urgency. "The ones you gave me," Ridge said, "I keep those in my shop. On the wall." She looked at him. "Really?" "Yeah." "They're safe there?" He held her gaze. "Nothing bothers them," he said. She nodded and put her drawings in her backpack and zipped it closed and held the backpack against her chest, and Ridge watched her go back inside with her arm around it like it contained something irreplaceable, which it did. It contained her documentation of her own life, rendered in crayon, page after careful page. Evelyn said nothing until the side door had closed. Then, "He knows we're paying attention." "Yes." "That changes the timeline." She looked at the corner of the building. "If he feels watched, the behavior inside that house will change. Not improve. Change. It'll go places that are harder to see and harder to document." Ridge looked at the space where Avery had been sitting. There were 2 small crayon marks on the concrete step, yellow and purple, from where the crayons had rolled when she'd gathered them quickly. The colors were vivid against the gray concrete, the only colors in the whole morning. "I need to see the house," he said. Evelyn looked at him. "Not inside. I need to see the outside. Where it is, what it looks like. I need to know what she's describing when she describes it." "That's not... I won't do anything." He looked at her with the specific directness that meant this was decided. not proposed. I'll look, I'll leave. But I need to see what she sees. Evelyn read him for a long moment. She'd known him long enough to know the difference between him deciding and him asking, and this was him deciding, and the decision was already inside him like something with weight. I'll get the address, she said. County records. I can get it tonight. She got it that night. Ridge sat on her kitchen steps while she came back to the door with a piece of paper that had an address on it, and he folded it into his jacket pocket without looking at it and drove home. He waited 3 days. He told himself the waiting was discipline. It was also partly fear, not the physical fear of confrontation, which he'd long since burned through, but a deeper fear, the fear of seeing the house and losing control of the thing he'd been so carefully building, the fear that the house would be exactly what Avery had drawn and that seeing it would make him into a different man than the one he was trying to be. He drove out on a Wednesday evening, an hour before dark. The Marsh house was on a private road, set back behind a white fence and a row of mature oaks that had dropped their leaves and stood now in the late November light like structural drawings of trees, all angles and branch line and the particular severity of things that have shed their softening. The house was Victorian, 2 stories, dark gray with white trim, a wraparound porch, an attached garage. It was the kind of house that appeared in real estate listings with words like stately and well-maintained. Everything was precise. The shutters were even. The fence was painted. The walk was edged. Ridge stopped the bike on the road. He didn't pull into the private lane. He sat and looked at the house from 50 yards, and the cold came down around him and the engine idled. The bedroom Avery had described him, she'd said it was at the back of the house, 2nd floor. He could see one corner of the 2nd floor from here, 2 windows visible on the side elevation, both with curtains drawn. He looked at the fence. The gate at the end of the private lane was wrought iron, closed. There was a camera mounted on the gatepost. He looked at it, and it looked at him, and he looked at it for 2 more seconds, and then put the bike in gear and rode back toward the road. He was 20 yards down when he stopped. Because Avery had come around the side of the house, she was in the backyard. He could see her between the slats of the fence from the road, partially obscured, a small figure in a yellow coat with a purple backpack, moving slowly along the fence line of the backyard. She had something in her hand. She wasn't drawing. It was too cold to draw outdoors. She appeared to be putting something into the ground at the base of the fence. Not digging, just pressing something into the soft earth, small objects placed at intervals. He watched for 30 seconds. She didn't see him. The house was behind her and she was facing the fence and the bare ground, and her small hands worked with the serious intentness of someone carrying out a plan they'd arrived at alone. Then the back door of the house opened and Martin Marsh appeared on the rear porch, and Avery's head came up and she took 2 quick steps back from the fence, and her hands went to the straps of her backpack and she was entirely still before Martin had fully stepped through the door. Ridge was already moving. He put the bike in gear and rode north without looking back, and he didn't stop until he'd cleared 2 miles and his chest was doing something that wasn't a panic attack because he didn't have those, but was adjacent to one in the way a storm is adjacent to the conditions that produce it. He pulled off at a pullout near the creek and sat with the engine running and his hands on the handlebars and breathed. She was planting something in the ground along the fence. Avery, who hid her crayons under her mattress. Avery, who gave her drawings to Ridge and called his shop a safe place for them. Avery, who had found every possible method of putting pieces of herself somewhere outside the reach of the people who controlled her space. She was 5 years old and she was building caches. He called Evelyn. She picked up on the 2nd ring. "I saw the house," he said. "I told you. I saw Avery." He described what he'd seen, the backyard, the fence, the small hands pressing objects into the earth, Martin coming to the back door and Avery going still. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "I'm calling Carol Voss tomorrow morning," she said. "I won't wait for Sunday." "Okay." "Ridge." A pause. "What you're describing, a child that age creating external caches for her belongings, that's not a quirk. That's a trauma response. That's a child who has had her possessions taken from her as a form of control and has developed a strategy around it. That's in the documentation now. Say it out loud so I can write it." He said it out loud. She repeated it back in clinical language that was both colder and more devastating than his version. He heard her writing. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. He rode home. He ate nothing. He sat in the shop until midnight going over what he had. Drawings pinned to the corkboard above the workbench. Dates written beside each one in his angular hand. Notes on index cards about each Sunday. Behavioral details he'd written down in the evenings when the observations were still sharp. He'd never been formally educated in any of this. He'd learned it the hard way, over years, reading things after Sophie's hospitalization that he'd wished he'd read before, understanding patterns he should have been able to name sooner. He looked at the drawing with the wings. He'd kept it separate from the others, tacked at the center of the board. The motorcycle in flight over. What, exactly? She'd said the bad parts. Over the bad parts. He needed more. He needed something he didn't have yet, some piece of the picture that would make Carol Voss's case undeniable, that would move the needle from concerning pattern to immediate action required. He'd been turning this over for days, trying to identify the gap, and he found it now at midnight in the cold shop light, staring at the board. He had no visual of the interior. He had Avery's drawings, which were the interior as she perceived and rendered it. But he had no photograph, no independent visual corroboration of the exterior lock, the room, the basement. He needed someone to go inside the house. Not him, not Evelyn. Someone with a legitimate reason to be there. Someone whose presence in that home would not trigger Martin Marsh's surveillance instincts. Someone the Marshes would invite in without calculation. He sat with this problem for 40 minutes. Then Cass Whitmore's name came up. The way names come up at midnight when you're desperate and running out of cleaner options. Not because Cass was the right tool, but because Cass was the available one. Cass, who'd been trying for 4 years to get Ridge to his wife's birthday dinners. Cass, who knew everyone in the county because parts were the thing everyone needed, and Cass was the man who had them. Cass, whose wife did something Ridge had never quite pinned down. Some kind of community outreach work, something adjacent to the school system. He picked up his phone. It was after midnight. He stared at Cass's number. He put the phone down. Not tonight. Not like this. He went upstairs and lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind come off the mountain and thought about a small girl pressing things into the earth along a fence line in the last hour of daylight, building a hiding place the way children are not supposed to need to build hiding places, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been doing this long enough to get good at it. He was asleep before he understood he was falling. But Evelyn called Carol Voss on Thursday morning and couldn't reach her. She left a message and called again Friday and reached an assistant who said Voss was in the field and would return calls the following week. Ridge received this information at Evelyn's kitchen table on Friday evening and said nothing. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. Evelyn watched him process the gap between what was needed and what was available, and she didn't fill the silence because she knew there was nothing to fill it with. "Sunday is in 2 days," he said. "I know. If Martin Marsh knows we're watching, we don't know that he counted the drawings," Ridge said. He said it quietly and without heat, but there was something under it that Evelyn recognized, something that had been very carefully banked and managed for weeks, and that was beginning, despite everything, to find its edges. "He counted the drawings," she agreed. "If he moves Avery—" He stopped. He put both hands flat on the table. "If he keeps her inside, away from Sunday, we've had one missed Sunday in 6. It doesn't—" "Evelyn," he said her name the way he said the things he meant. "I need you to tell me what I do if she's not there Sunday." The kitchen was quiet. The house sound. The far wind. "You do nothing," Evelyn said. "You wait." He looked at her. "You wait," she said again. And her voice was the voice of someone who has had to say this in impossible contexts and knows exactly how insufficient it sounds and says it anyway, because it is still the right answer. You wait and you trust what we're building, and you do not walk up that private road, and you do not do anything that gives Martin Marsh the right to call law enforcement on you and have you removed from this entire situation. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at the window. Outside, the night was complete, and the temperature had dropped below 20, and somewhere north of here, on a private road behind a white fence and a row of bare oaks, a little girl with gray-green eyes was in a room with a lock on the outside of the door. "She planted things in the ground," he said, "in the yard." "I know. In case she couldn't get to them. In case they were taken." He looked at his hands on the table. "She planned for the contingency that she'd lose access to the things that were hers." Evelyn said nothing. "She's 5 years old," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. The silence held between them like a physical thing. Ridge's phone buzzed on the table, an unknown number, local area code, and he stared at it for a second before picking up. "This Ridge Mercer?" Male voice, slightly rough, familiar in some register he couldn't immediately locate. "Yes?" "You left a card at Miller's garage in September, about restoration work. I've got a 94 Dyna that needs someone who knows what they're doing." He almost said wrong time. He almost said, "Call me next week." But the voice was tugging at something. The roughness, the cadence, the particular economy of a man who didn't make calls he didn't need to make. "Who is this?" Ridge asked. "Boone," the voice said. "Boone Garrett. You know a man named Cass Whitmore?" Ridge went still. "He said you were the man to call," Boone said. "Said you did solid work and didn't overcharge. I got a bike and I got a problem, and Cass said Ridge Mercer was someone you could trust." Ridge looked at Evelyn. She was watching him with the pewter eyes, reading the shift in his posture, the particular quality of his attention. "Bring it in Monday," Ridge said. "Morning?" "Monday morning," Boone said. "I'll be there." He hung up. He looked at his phone. The name Boone Garrett didn't connect to anything in his immediate recent memory, but it connected to something older, something from before. A name heard at a distance, spoken in a context he deliberately kept distant from for 11 years. "What?" Evelyn said. "A customer," Ridge said. But something was moving in him, some low, wordless frequency of information that his body was receiving before his mind had finished processing it. A name like Boone Garrett didn't appear in a county like this without carrying weight behind it. A man who rode a 94 Dyna and got Ridge's number from Cass Whitmore on a Friday night wasn't calling about restoration work. Or he was, and the restoration work was real, and Ridge was so deep in this thing now that everything arriving looked like it had a second meaning. He went home. Monday morning at 7:58, a 1994 Harley-Davidson Dyna Wide Glide rolled down Ridge's gravel driveway. The engine sound preceded it by 30 seconds. A particular sound, rough and low and deep, in the chest cavity way of old American iron that hasn't been civilized, that still runs with the mechanical honesty of the era before computer management softened everything. Ridge came out of the shop with a mug and stood in the cold and listened to it come. The man who got off the bike was not what Ridge had pictured from the voice, which was to say he was larger. 6'3", broad through the chest and shoulders, somewhere in his late 40s, with a face that looked like it had been outdoors for most of those years and hadn't apologized for it. Dark hair going gray at the temple, a beard kept short, the kind of eyes, dark brown, very direct, that Ridge associated with men who had spent time in environments where being wrong about what you were seeing could be costly. He wore a heavy canvas jacket over a flannel, work boots, and the particular ease in the body of a man who is comfortable with his own size. He looked at Ridge. Ridge looked at him. "Mercer," the man said. "Garrett," Ridge said. Boone Garrett walked the bike onto the lift with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly where a machine's weight wanted to go, and Ridge watched the 94 Dyna come up under the shop lights and looked at what was actually wrong with it. The primary chain cover had a stress crack, and someone had done a patch on the oil line that was not going to hold much longer, and there were 3 things in the brake assembly that needed attention. He said all of this. Boone listened. "How long?" Boone asked. "End of next week if I prioritize it." Boone nodded. He looked around the shop. The parts wall, the corkboard above the workbench, which Ridge had turned face in against the wall when he heard the bike coming up the driveway. The clean, organized, controlled aesthetic of a space that was also a life. "Cass said you used to ride with the Ashwood Brotherhood," Boone said. There it was. Ridge kept his hands on the secondary chain inspection and his voice level. "Long time ago." "Yeah," Boone said. "He mentioned." He looked at the turned-over corkboard. That's a lot of papers you got there. Inventory system, Ridge said. Boone looked at him. Sure, he said. The word had a bottom to it. Ridge straightened up and met his eyes, and the two men stood in the cold shop light with 11 years of mutual adjacent history between them and said nothing for a moment. You got a number I can call when it's ready? Boone asked. I've got yours, Ridge said. Boone nodded. He pulled his jacket tighter and walked to the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, Cass also mentioned you've had some trouble recently. Ridge kept his breathing even. What kind of trouble? Didn't say. Boone turned around. He looked at Ridge directly, with the full weight of those dark brown eyes, and the assessment in them was the assessment of a man who is deciding something. Just said Ridge Mercer was a man who used to know how to ask for help and forgot how somewhere along the line. A pause. Said it'd be worth my time to come by. Ridge looked at him for a long moment. You with the Brotherhood? Ridge asked. Boone's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the acknowledgement of a direct question deserving a direct answer. Adjacent, he said. What does that mean? It means I know who you used to be, Boone said, and I'm curious about who you are now. He pushed the door open. I'll be in touch about the bike. He walked out. Ridge heard his truck. He'd driven a truck here, left a separate vehicle down the road, brought the Dinah in the bed. Start and back out and crunch down the gravel drive, and the sound of it faded south toward the county road. Ridge stood alone in the shop with his hands hanging at his sides and his chest doing something complicated. Adjacent. He turned the corkboard back around. He looked at the drawings. He looked at the notes. He looked at the 3-week arc of documentation and the phone call to county services that had gone nowhere, and the name Carol Voss written on a piece of paper in Evelyn's handwriting, and the gap, the maddening gap, between what he knew and what he could prove and what proving it actually required. He'd been trying to do this as a different man than he'd been. He'd been trying to do it through channels, with documentation, with clinical language and professional credibility and patience. He'd been trying to give Avery what Sophie hadn't gotten. A case so solid it couldn't be dismissed, built by the right people in the right way. But Martin Marsh had counted the drawings on a Sunday morning, and he'd looked at Evelyn with those calculating eyes, and something had changed in the house that Ridge couldn't see but could feel, the way you can feel a change in pressure before a storm arrives. And a man named Boone Garrett had ridden a Dyna-Wide glide down a gravel drive and used the word adjacent and left, and Ridge's phone had his number in it. He looked at the drawing with the wings on the motorcycle. So it can fly over the bad parts. He was out of slow. His thumb found Boone Garrett's number. He pressed call before he'd finished deciding, the way all the choices that matter get made, in the space before the mind can talk the body out of it, in the moment between the breath and the word, in the particular dark of a November morning when a man is run out of the version of himself that was willing to wait. It rang twice. Garrett, the voice said. I need to talk to someone, Ridge said, not about the bike. A beat. 2. The particular quality of silence that means a decision is being made on the other end. A door being weighed, a cost being calculated. How soon? Boone said. Tonight, Ridge said. And the thing that had been building for 6 weeks, the thing he'd managed and banked and controlled and kept within the boundaries of the man he was trying to be, shifted irrevocably the way a watershed moment shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, the way a river changes its course, and suddenly everything that follows flows in a different direction than everything before. Tonight, Boone said, I know a place. The place Boone Garrett knew was a garage, not a shop. A garage, the kind that exists on the edge of working properties, attached to nothing, lit by 2 bare bulbs on a cord strung between the rafters, smelling of oil and cold concrete, and the particular dense smell of men who have spent years in spaces like this. It was 12 miles east of Ridge's shop on a road that didn't have a name on any map he'd ever used, and he followed Boone's truck through 2 turns that weren't marked, and one that crossed a creek on a wooden bridge that Ridge's weight made creak in a way that didn't inspire confidence. He heard the other bikes before he saw the garage. 2 of them, from the sound, different engines, one newer than the other, both idling down as he came up the gravel. And when he came around the last curve, the garage was there, its double doors open, yellow light spilling out onto the frozen ground, and the two bikes were parked out front with their riders standing beside them, watching him come. He parked next to Boone's truck. He killed the engine. He sat for a moment in the cold and looked at the men. There were 3 of them total, including Boone, who'd arrived first and was standing in the garage doorway with his arms crossed and the same dark-eyed directness he'd carried into the shop that morning. The other 2 were positioned with the unconscious geometry of men who have spent time in situations where positioning matters. Not threatening, not performing, just placed with the awareness of people who think spatially and habitually. The nearer one was compact, maybe 40, with a shaved head going to stubble and a scar along the left jaw that had been put there by something that required stitches. He wore a cut over his jacket, not a full club vest, but a cut, and it bore a single patch on the chest that Ridge couldn't read from here in the dark. The further one was older, maybe 60, tall and angular, with the kind of frame that suggested he'd been built heavier once and had burned it down to the essential. White beard, kept short. He held a cigarette, and he was the stillest of the 3, which made him the one Ridge paid most attention to. Ridge got off the bike. "Mercer," Boone said. "You didn't say there'd be others," Ridge said. "You didn't ask." He looked at the 3 men. He looked at the garage. He looked at the single road in and out and the creek bridge 2 curves back and the tree line that surrounded everything on 3 sides in the way that Virginia ridgeline trees surrounded things. Complete, dark, absolute. "I'm not here to join anything," Ridge said. "Nobody asked you to," the older man said. He had a voice like gravel in a tin can, not rough from affectation but from mileage, from decades of cold air, and probably tobacco, and probably things harder than tobacco. "Come in out of the cold." Ridge came in. The garage smelled the way it looked, concrete and oil and the faint sweet smell of bar and chain oil someone had used recently, and coffee from a percolator sitting on a makeshift counter along the back wall made from 2 sawhorses and a sheet of plywood. Boone poured 4 cups without asking. The compact man with the scar jaw took his and leaned against a workbench. The older man stood near the center of the space and watched Ridge with the pewter patience of someone who had been watching men walk into rooms for a very long time and had learned something from all of it. "Lyle," the older man said, which Ridge understood to be his name and nothing else. "Dell," said the compact man without extending a hand. Ridge nodded. He took the coffee. It was bad, but it was hot, and the cold had been in him since he'd left the shop, and it needed something to push against. "Cass told you about me," Ridge said to Boone. "Cass told me you were solid. Said you used to ride with Ashwood and left clean." Boone held his mug in both hands. The leaving clean part interested me. "Why?" "Because most men who leave don't leave clean. They leave in pieces, or they leave in anger, or they leave because they lost something and they're not coming back for it. You left because you decided something." He looked at Ridge steadily. "I'm curious about men who decide things." Ridge looked around the garage. There were no club markings on the walls, no banners, no artwork, nothing that staked organizational claim. There was a whiteboard on the east wall with nothing written on it. There was a set of shelves holding tools arranged with the deliberateness of a man who used them and knew where everything was. And there, on the bottom shelf, weighted under a half brick, was a manila folder that wasn't a motorcycle manual. "What is this?" Ridge asked. "A conversation," Lyle said. "You didn't drive 12 miles through dark roads for a conversation." "No," Lyle agreed. "I didn't." He put his coffee on the plywood counter and looked at Ridge with the full weight of 60 years of paying attention to things. "You've been watching a child." The temperature in Ridge's chest dropped about 10 degrees. "Cass," Ridge said. "Cass doesn't know the details," Boone said. "He said you had trouble. Said it felt like the kind of thing that was too big for one man. But Cass doesn't know what I'm dealing with." "No," Lyle said. "But I might." He picked up the folder from the bottom shelf. He didn't open it. He held it, and he looked at Ridge, and the quality of what was in his eyes was not the quality of a man making a move in a strategy. It was the quality of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is deciding whether the man across from him is someone he can set part of it down with. "What's the child's name?" Ridge looked at him for a long moment. "Avery," he said. Lyle opened the folder. He extracted a single photograph and held it out, and Ridge crossed the garage and took it. It was a photograph of a child. Not Avery. A different child. Older, maybe 8, dark-haired, with the same unmistakable quality of expression that Ridge had spent 6 weeks learning to read. The measurement, the containment, the particular stillness behind the eyes of a child who monitors rather than inhabits a room. The photograph had been taken outdoors, at a distance, with a long lens, and the child was in a yard behind a white fence with her back to a large dark house. Ridge turned the photograph over. On the back, in neat block letters, Cassidy. Removed 2019, Warren County. He looked up at Lyle. Before Avery, Lyle said. The garage was very quiet. Martin Marsh, Ridge said. He wasn't Martin Marsh in Warren County, Lyle said. He was Martin Calloway. He used his wife's maiden name, which he'd been using since 2016 when he and Diane relocated from West Virginia. He reached into the folder again and laid 2 more photographs on the plywood counter. Before Cassidy, there was a boy named Owen in West Virginia. Before Owen, he stopped. He put both palms flat on the counter. Before Owen, there was a girl named Ruby, and Ruby didn't make it to removal. The sound in Ridge's ears was very specific. Not silence, but the thing that precedes sound, the frequency below hearing that the body registers before the mind does. He looked at the photographs. He looked at Lyle. "Who are you?" Ridge said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. "A man who's been watching the Marsh family for 14 months, Lyle said. A man whose niece adopted a little boy named Owen out of the West Virginia system in 2021, and who found out 2 years later what Owen had been through before the state finally moved. A man who started pulling the thread on Martin Calloway Marsh because someone had to." He looked at Ridge with the steady weight of everything that had cost. "And a man who has been trying to build a case that doesn't blow up in his hands, because every time someone moves too fast, this man moves. New county, new name variation, new church community, new civic presence. And the clock resets and another child goes into that house." Ridge set the photograph down on the counter. He put it down carefully, the way you put down something that needs to be preserved, and he pressed his fingers flat against it for a moment, as if he could push through it. "How many?" he said. "Children in that house?" Lyle's jaw tightened. "Since 2013, we've identified 4 by name. There may be 1 before Ruby that we haven't confirmed. 3 were removed by state action after pattern documentation: Owen, Cassidy, and a girl named Petra who was in the house in Warren County, concurrent with Cassidy for about 8 months. A pause that had the weight of everything it contained. Ruby was the first. She died in 2015, ruled an accident. The state closed the case in 6 weeks. The cigarette between Dell's fingers had burned almost to his knuckles. He dropped it, put it out with his boot, didn't take another one. Boone had set his coffee down and was looking at the middle distance. Ridge stood with his hands on the plywood counter and breathed through his nose 4 counts, and it didn't help the way it was supposed to. 2015, he said. Yes. What was the ruling? Accidental fall, home stairs, she was 6. Lyle said it flatly. The flatness of a man who has said it before and said it until the saying of it stopped destroying him every time, which meant it had taken a long time and had not entirely worked. Martin Calloway called it in himself. He was very cooperative with the investigation. He cried in the interview. The marriage was presenting as stable. They had community standing in Martinsburg. The M.E. report cited... He stopped. He looked at the photograph. The M.E. report was inadequate. I don't use stronger language than that because stronger language doesn't hold up in the places where this needs to hold up. Ridge understood what stronger language would be. He didn't say it. Avery, he said, has been in the house 11 months. Something physical happened in Ridge's chest. A compression, fast and specific, like a fist around the organ. 11 months. He'd found her 6 weeks ago. She'd been in that house for 11 months before he'd found her. You've known about her, Ridge said. We identified Avery's placement 4 months ago, Lyle said. We've been building. 4 months. Ridge looked at him. He kept his voice at the temperature he needed it at, which required most of his available discipline. She's been in that house for 11 months. You've known for 4, and you've been building. Ridge. Boone said his name with the kind of weight that wasn't a warning exactly, but was a request. Stay in the part of yourself that reasons. We couldn't move fast, Lyle said. I know how that sounds. I know what it costs. His eyes were steady on Ridge, and they were not defensive. They were carrying the cost, fully, without trying to make it lighter than it was. We couldn't move fast because moving fast on this man is what lets him move. We've watched it happen twice. Warren County started a formal investigation in 2019, and within 3 weeks the Marshes were gone. Cassidy was in limbo during the transition period, 4 days with nowhere to go while the system caught up. And she experienced things during those 4 days that she is still in treatment for. Ridge looked at the floor. Moving fast is what he counts on, Lyle said. He knows how the system responds to pressure. He knows the escape routes. He's been running this pattern for more than a decade, and he is very good at it because he has had practice and because nobody has ever managed to have everything in place before he knew they were coming. He picked up the folder. Until possibly now. Ridge raised his head. Your documentation, Lyle said. The nurse. Evelyn Hart. With clinical credentials and 30 years in pediatric care. Lyle nodded. And you have 6 weeks of behavioral observation in a neutral context, plus the drawings, plus the county call on record, which establishes prior report, which matters to investigators. He looked at Ridge carefully. What we have is 14 months of pattern documentation across 2 counties, 2 prior state actions, a closed case from 2015 that a forensic investigator in Charleston has been looking at with fresh eyes for the past 8 months. He paused. And we have Carol Voss. Ridge went still. You know Carol Voss, Ridge said. Carol Voss has been working this from the state advocacy tier since Cassidy's case, Lyle said. She has been waiting for a county-level concurrent documentation package that gives her grounds for a multi-agency approach that bypasses the county system entirely, bypasses the individual caseworker level, goes directly to a state-coordinated response team that can move on a single morning and be done before Martin Marsh understands what's happening. The silence in the garage had a different quality now. Not the silence of men withholding, but the silence of men who have arrived at a place where everything is visible and the visibility is terrible and necessary simultaneously. Evelyn had been calling Carol Voss. Carol Voss had already known. She didn't tell Evelyn, Ridge said. She couldn't. Compartmentalization is protocol. If Evelyn had known the full picture, it might have changed her behavior in observation context with the Marshes, and any change in Evelyn's behavior might have been read by Martin Marsh. Lyle looked at him steadily. Every person who knows the full picture is another variable. Voss has been managing variables for 14 months. Ridge looked at Boone. Boone was watching him with the dark, direct eyes, and he wasn't offering anything. Not reassurance, not interpretation, just the observation of a man letting another man land where he needs to land. What do you need from me? Ridge said. His voice was level, and it had cost him something to level it. What you've built, Lyle said. Your documentation, Evelyn Hart's clinical notes, your testimony about behavioral observation, structured and dated. We need it in a format that can go into the package Voss is assembling. He looked at Ridge. And we need it in the next 72 hours. Why 72? Lyle and Boone exchanged a look. It was brief, 1 second, 2, but it contained something, and Ridge clocked it the way he clocked everything that mattered, and his chest tightened again. What happened? Ridge said. Boone reached into his jacket and laid a phone on the plywood counter, screen up, with a photograph displayed. It was a photograph taken from a car, through glass, of a moving truck on a street Ridge recognized. He recognized the street because he'd been on it once, in the cold, watching a little girl press things into the earth along a fence line. It was Martin Marsh's street. The moving truck was backed up to the front of the dark Victorian house. Ridge looked at the photograph. He looked at Boone. He looked at Lyle. When was this taken? He said. This afternoon, Boone said. 4 o'clock. Dell did a pass. Dell, who had been silent against the workbench throughout, looked at Ridge with the flat gray eyes of a man who had seen this before and was managing what that looked like on his face. Two men, carrying boxes. Side door. He said it in short declarative units, compressed, each one landing like something dropped on concrete. Marsh was in the driveway on a phone call, smiling. Ridge turned away from the counter. He put both hands on the wall beside the garage door and stood with his back to the room and looked at the dark outside, at the absolute Virginia dark of a ridgeline night with no ambient light and no softening, and he breathed. Martin Marsh knew. He didn't know what specifically, didn't know about Lyle, didn't know about Carol Voss, didn't know the full picture. But he'd counted the drawings on a Sunday morning, and he'd looked at Evelyn with those measuring eyes, and he'd done the calculation that a man with his particular skill set does when the variables start multiplying, and he'd started packing. Where would he go? Ridge said. He didn't turn around. He's done this before, Lyle said. West Virginia to Warren County was 3 hours. He has family in Tennessee, Diane's family, outside Knoxville. There's also a property in Delaware that came up in our financial research, under a corporate name that connects to Diane's mother. Avery goes with them, Ridge said. She's their legal adoptive child, Lyle said. Yes. Ridge turned around. He looked at Lyle with everything that was in him. Everything from 11 years of Sophie's dislocated shoulder and the word unsubstantiated and the Sunday mornings on the concrete step and the drawing with the wings and the crayons hidden under the mattress. And he kept it all within the line of his face by an effort of will that was not small and that nobody in the room had any obligation to understand. How long to get the package to Voss? He said. If we work tonight, Lyle said, tomorrow morning, early, she can file for the coordinated response by end of business tomorrow. A multi-agency team can be deployed. He stopped. He breathed. Day after tomorrow at the earliest, more likely Thursday morning. The moving truck is there today, Ridge said. Yes. If they finish loading and leave before Thursday, we have the Tennessee address, we have the Delaware property, we have interstate coordination contacts in both states through Voss's network. Lyle looked at him directly. It's not ideal. Moving this to another state is harder in every way, but it's not impossible. For Avery, it's not about impossible, Ridge said. It's about 2 more nights in that house with a man who is packing boxes and knows something is coming. The garage was very quiet. Dell lit a new cigarette. The lighter flame was the only warm color in the cold light of the space. I need to call Evelyn, Ridge said. Now, Lyle said. Tonight. Ridge was already pulling out his phone. He walked to the door and stepped out into the cold and called her, and she picked up on the first ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. I need you to come somewhere, he said. Tonight. Bring the notebook. A beat. Ridge, what's happened? I'll explain when you get here. I'm going to text you the address. He stopped. Evelyn, how long would it take you to write up a formal clinical summary from your notes? Something structured for a state-level investigative package. The pause was very brief. 3 hours, she said, if I have my notes. Bring everything, he said. Every Sunday's notes, every observation, the dates, the behavioral language, all of it. Ridge. Her voice had shifted, lower, more precise. Tell me what we're dealing with. He turned and looked back through the open garage doors at the 3 men inside, at the photographs on the plywood counter, at the folder Lyle was holding. He thought about Ruby, who had been 6 years old and had not been removed in time, and about Owen, and about Cassidy's 4 days of limbo, and about a moving truck backed up to a dark Victorian house on a private road. He thought about what Avery had pressed into the earth along the fence. He hadn't known what the objects were when he'd watched her bury them. He understood now. She'd been putting things somewhere safe because she was, at 5 years old, anticipating the contingency of leaving without warning, of losing what she had, of the particular kind of vanishing that happened to children in houses like hers. She'd known before he had. Martin Marsh has done this before, Ridge said. We're not the first people who've noticed. We're just the first ones who have a chance to finish it. He paused. Come now. I'll explain the rest when you're here. She came. She arrived 40 minutes later in the gray Tacoma, backing onto the frozen gravel with the competence of a woman who drove rural dark roads without drama. and she came into the garage with her wire-bound notebook under her arm and looked at the three men and at the photographs on the counter and at Ridge's face, and she didn't ask anything else. She sat at the plywood counter with her notebook open and her pen in her hand, and she said to Lyle, "Tell me what format Carol Voss needs." They worked until 2 in the morning. Evelyn wrote in the clinical language she'd been developing for 30 years. Precise, structured, anchored to observed behavior and dated documentation. Free of interpretation where interpretation could be challenged. Ridge added his own account. The first Sunday, the bruise, the sequence of interactions, the drawings, the county call, the disclosures about the locked door and the nighttime isolation, the behavioral indicators in the presence of Martin and Diane. Lyle shaped it into the framework that Voss's state-level process required. Dell made more bad coffee, and nobody complained. At midnight, something happened that nobody had planned for. Ridge's phone rang. The number was local. He looked at it for a second before answering. "Mr. Mercer." Female voice, professional, carrying something under the professional surface that he couldn't immediately categorize. "This is Carol Voss. I understand you've been trying to reach me." He looked at Lyle. Lyle looked at his phone. He'd messaged someone at some point in the last hour, Ridge now understood, had triggered this call. "Yes," Ridge said. "I need you to understand something," Voss said. "Before we go further, what I'm going to ask you to do is not comfortable, and it is not safe in the traditional sense, and it requires you to trust a process that has not given you reasons to trust processes in the past." She said this without preamble or cushioning, and he respected that immediately. "But the package you're building tonight, if it's as solid as I'm being told, gives me grounds to file for a state-coordinated removal, not a county assessment. A full multi-agency removal team with law enforcement and medical personnel on the ground before that family has time to respond." "They're loading a moving truck," Ridge said. "I know," she said. "I've known since 4:15. A pause. "I have a contact watching the property. Nothing moves out of that driveway without my knowing." The breath Ridge released was long and slow and controlled. "The package needs to be in my email by 6 a.m., Voss said. "I file at 7. If everything holds, I have a team authorized and staged by Wednesday night." Another pause, and in this one there was something human and specific. The sound of a woman who has been carrying this for 14 months and is telling someone, for the first time, what it has cost. "Ruby Calloway would be 12 now," she said. "I have thought about that every day since 2017 when her case crossed my desk and I understood what I was looking at." Ridge said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Get me the package," Voss said. 6 a.m. She ended the call. He stood in the cold outside the garage for 30 seconds. Then he went back in and sat down at the plywood counter and said, "We have until 6. And everyone in the room understood what that meant and what it required, and they went back to work. At 1:47 in the morning, Dell came in from outside. He'd gone out for a cigarette and hadn't come back for 12 minutes, which was long. And he stood in the doorway and said, in the compressed, flat way he said everything, "Moving truck's still there." Nobody responded for a moment. Then Lyle said, "How do you know?" "I drove past," Dell said. Lyle looked at him. Dell met the look without adjustment. "We agreed," Lyle started. "I drove past on the county road," Dell said. "Didn't stop, didn't slow down, could see the truck from the road, still there." He came in and picked up his coffee. "Still there," he said again, which was both report and reassurance. Ridge looked at the clock on his phone. 1:47. He thought about Avery in that house. The room with the lock on the outside, the light from the window, the crayons under the mattress. He thought about whether she knew the truck was there, whether she'd seen it from her window, whether she'd understood what it meant the way she seemed to understand everything, with the rapid, sophisticated comprehension of a child who had been required to develop it too fast. He thought about the objects she'd pressed into the earth along the fence line. At 2:14, the package was complete. Evelyn read the final clinical summary aloud while Lyle checked it against the format requirements Voss had specified, and Ridge listened for anything he'd missed or misstated, any gap that a defense attorney or an opposing system could insert doubt into. There were two places where the language needed adjustment. One where Ridge had used a word that was too interpretive, one where a date was ambiguous. And they fixed both. Lyle formatted it, compiled the photograph scans he had, the exterior of the house, the vehicle registrations, the historical documentation from Warren County and West Virginia. Evelyn's clinical summary, Ridge's behavioral observation record, the drawings scanned and dated, the county call log, which Ridge had saved as a screenshot. Lyle sent it at 5:58 a.m. They sat in the cold garage in the aftermath of it. Nobody said anything for a long time. The percolator had stopped making good coffee around midnight and was now making something that was technically coffee in the way that surviving a thing is technically living through it. Boone was the one who finally spoke. "Go home," he said to Ridge. "Sleep. We'll call when there's movement." "I'm not going to sleep," Ridge said. "I know you're not," Boone said. "Go home anyway." Ridge looked at him. He looked at Lyle, who was reading something on his phone with an expression that said he was managing information and would share it when he'd decided what it meant. He looked at Evelyn, who had closed her notebook and was sitting with her coffee in both hands and her eyes at the middle distance, doing something internal that Ridge recognized as the process of putting things back in their places before the next thing was required. He stood. He put his jacket on. "Lyle," he said. Lyle looked up. "Ruby," Ridge said. "Just the name. Just the one word carrying everything." Lyle held his gaze. "I know," he said. Ridge walked out into the dark. The cold was absolute. Below 20 now, hard and clear, the stars visible in the black above the tree line. He started the bike and the engine turned over with the particular sound of a cold engine in cold air, reluctant and then committed. And he let it warm for 30 seconds and then rode out, following his own headlight through the unmarked turns, over the wooden bridge that creaked under his weight, back to the county road. He rode home. The cold came at him from the north, and he didn't fight it, just kept his eyes on the road and let the cold be what it was, the thing that was true about this morning, the thing that couldn't be managed or documented or adjusted, just experienced and moved through. He was 3 miles from his shop when his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He stopped at the shoulder. He pulled the phone out. It was a text from a number he didn't have saved. Short, no preamble. Truck left the property 3:47 a.m. Dell is following. Unknown destination. Ridge read it twice. 3:47. While they were finalizing the package. While Evelyn was reading the clinical summary aloud and Lyle was checking the formatting and Ridge was listening for gaps. While they were in the garage, 4 miles away, the truck had left. He sat on the bike on the shoulder of the county road, and his headlight illuminated 20 feet of asphalt, and then stopped, and beyond that was just dark. The cold pressed against him from every direction. The trees stood in the dark on both sides with the absolute stillness of things that exist outside of human emergency. He called Boone. "I know," Boone said. He picked up before the first ring finished. "I know, we're tracking it. If they're in the truck, we don't know who's in the truck. Could be movers, could be one of them, could be both." A pause. "Could be all three." All three. Ridge's hands tightened on the phone. "If Avery is in that truck," he said, "and they get to a state line before Voss's team is authorized." "Dell has eyes on it," Boone said. "We know the route. I have a call in to Voss right now." His voice was the voice of a man who had run scenarios like this before, who knew what the variables were and was moving through them without the luxury of stopping to feel what they cost. "Ridge, I need you to go home. I need you to be where I can reach you. I need you to not be on that county road on a motorcycle at 3 a.m. making decisions." Ridge looked at the dark beyond his headlight. "She's been in that house 11 months, he said. "I know. She buried things in the yard." "I know," Boone said, and in the 2 words there was something that Ridge recognized as the sound a man makes when he's been carrying the same weight long enough that the carrying of it has changed his voice. "I know. Go home." Ridge ended the call. He sat on the bike on the dark road and looked at the 20 feet of lit asphalt and the wall of dark beyond it, and he thought about everything that was true. He thought about Carol Voss filing at 7 a.m., which was 3 hours from now. He thought about Dell behind a moving truck on a dark road, running plates, tracking movement. He thought about the package in Voss's email, compiled over 8 hours in a cold garage by 5 people who had nothing in common except the particular gravity of what they'd understood too late about people who looked like Martin Marsh. He thought about what happened if Voss's filing was too late. He thought about what he would do then. He put the phone in his pocket. He sat with the engine idling and the cold absolute around him, and he felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, the full weight of where he actually was. Past the point of documentation, past the point of process, past the point of the careful, different man he'd been trying to be. He was on a dark road with a case filed and a child in a moving truck, and a man who had done this before and would do it again, and the decision he'd been holding back for 6 weeks was not being held back anymore. It was being waited on. And the wait was going to be the hardest thing he'd ever done, because the other thing, the louder, older thing, the thing that had been a club enforcer and a man who resolved things with his body before he'd learned to resolve them with documents. That thing was not asleep and had not been asleep for 6 weeks. It had been patient. It had been extremely, extraordinarily patient. And somewhere on a dark Virginia road, a moving truck was carrying Avery away from the one place Ridge could find her, and the patient thing was running out of patience. He put the bike in gear. He didn't go home. He rode north on the county road with his headlight cutting through the absolute dark and his phone in his jacket pocket, and the engine loud enough in the cold air that he could feel it in his sternum, and he told himself he was just riding, just moving, just doing the thing that kept the older version of himself manageable, and that was partly true and partly the most sophisticated lie he'd told himself in years. Boone called at 4:11. "Dell's got the truck," Boone said. "Northbound on 81. 2 occupants in the cab. Can't confirm who." "What about the house?" A pause. 1 second. 2. The specific duration of a pause that contains information being decided on. "House is dark," Boone said. "Every window." Ridge pulled off at a wide gravel shoulder and stopped and put his boot down and sat with the engine running and the cold coming at him and looked at the dark road going north. "She could still be in the house," he said. "Yes." "Or she's in the truck." "Yes," he breathed. "Someone needs to be at that house." Ridge, not inside, at the house. If she's still there and that's 2 of them in the truck and they left her alone. He stopped. He heard himself. He heard what he was building toward, and he made himself stop building it. "Boone, if she's alone in that house right now." The pause this time was longer and had a different texture. "I'll go," Boone said. "I'm closer." "I know you're closer. That's why I said I'll go." His voice was even, and it had the weight of a man who understood exactly what he was preventing and had decided to prevent it with his own body if necessary. "You go home. I will go to the house. I will look. I will call you in 15 minutes. "Boone." 15 minutes, Boone said, and ended the call. Ridge sat on the shoulder. He looked at the road going north and the road going south in the dark on both sides, and the stars going pale at the eastern edge where morning was building itself 4 hours too slowly. He called Evelyn. She picked up. She hadn't slept either. He could hear it, the particular clarity of someone who has moved through exhaustion into the lucid, strange country on the other side of it. He told her about the truck. She was quiet for a long moment. "If she's in the house alone," Evelyn said. "I know." "Ridge, you cannot go there." "Boone's going." "Okay," she exhaled. "Okay. And if she's in the truck?" "Dell's behind it. Voss has the filing. When the filing goes through, they can issue an emergency location order that crosses state lines." He said it the way you say things that are true but insufficient, that are the correct answer but not the needed one. "That takes time," Evelyn said. "I know it takes time." She said nothing. He said nothing. The cold sat between them through the phone, and the road was empty in both directions, and the engine idled under him with the steady mechanical patience of a thing that would run as long as it had fuel and asked nothing else of the world. His phone buzzed. "Boone." "She's here," Boone said. The breath that left Ridge's body was not controlled, and he didn't try to make it controlled. He put the phone back to his ear and said, "What?" and his voice was not level. "House is unlocked. Back door. I went in." A pause, and in the pause was the sound of interior space, of a man moving carefully through a dark house. She's upstairs. She's okay. Ridge, she's packed. She's got a bag. Small bag, like she knew. She knew, Ridge said. Yeah, Boone said quietly. I think she did. Ridge was already moving. He pulled out of the shoulder and went north and took the private road turn without slowing enough, and the bike slid 2 feet on the frozen gravel, and he corrected with his body without thinking, the physical language of it coming up through his hands and hips and into the machine, and the machine found its line and he rode it hard through the dark to the white fence and the wrought iron gate. The gate was open. He rode through and stopped in the front and killed the engine and got off and went to the front door. Boone opened it from inside. He was a large man in a dark jacket holding a flashlight he'd turned face down against his leg, and behind him the interior of the house was very dark and very quiet and smelled like cardboard, and the particular emptiness of a space being abandoned. Upstairs, Boone said. Ridge went up. The stairs were solid, old wood, and his boots were loud on them, and he didn't try to make them quiet because quiet wasn't what was needed. He found the room at the back of the house, second door on the left, and the lock was exactly where Avery had drawn it, the metal hasp on the exterior of the frame, sitting open because someone had left it open, probably the last time they'd come in, probably when the house was being cleared and Avery had been put here out of the way like something being managed. He pushed the door open. She was sitting on the bare mattress. The frame was still there, the mattress, but the bedding was gone, the rug was gone, the curtains were gone. With her purple backpack on her lap and her yellow coat on and her frog rain boots on, and her hands folded on top of the backpack in the particular posture of a child who has been waiting without knowing how long the waiting will be, who has given herself entirely over to the waiting because it's the only available action. She looked up when he came in. In the dark, with the pale coming morning light through the bare window, her gray-green eyes were very large and very still. I knew you'd come, she said. He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her so they were eye level, and he looked at her face, checked it, the way he'd been checking it every Sunday for 6 weeks, the full inventory of it, and what he saw was tired and scared, and underneath both of those things, something that was not either of them, something older and more complicated, the look of a child who made a correct prediction and is not surprised and is also not entirely relieved because correct predictions in her life have not always meant safety. Are you hurt? He said. No, she said. Then with a child's instinctive precision, not new, he breathed through his nose. Okay, he said. Okay, I'm going to carry you to my bike and we're going to go somewhere safe, all right? She looked at him. She looked at his face with the full weight of those eyes doing all that work, running the calculation, checking the data she'd accumulated over 6 Sunday mornings on a cold concrete step. Is Evelyn there? She asked. She will be, he said. She nodded. She held her arms out, backpack still clutched against her chest, and he picked her up. She weighed almost nothing, and it hit him like a physical blow, how little she weighed, how small she was against his chest. And he carried her down the old wood stairs with Boone ahead of them and out through the front door into the dark. His phone went off as he reached the bike. He shifted Avery to his left arm and answered with his right hand. Mercer. Carol Voss. Her voice was different than the previous call. Compressed, fast, the voice of someone running a scenario in real time. The truck stopped, 40 miles north on 81, a rest area. Dell has visual on Martin Marsh outside the vehicle. He's on a phone call. A half-second pause. Diane is not visible. Repeat. Diane Marsh is not confirmed in that vehicle. Ridge looked at Boone over Avery's head. Diane's not in the truck, he said. Boone's eyes changed. Just the eyes. The rest of his face stayed composed, the discipline of a man who'd trained himself out of visible reaction. But the eyes understood something before Ridge had finished the sentence. Where is she? Boone said. Voss, Ridge said into the phone. Diane Marsh's location. Unknown, Voss said. We have Martin in the truck. We do not have Diane. Boone already had his phone out. He was calling Dell. Ridge held Avery against his chest and felt her arms tighten around his neck, not in fear, or not only in fear, but in the particular grip of a child who has found something to hold on to and is not letting go until she has to, and maybe not even then. "Avery," Ridge said, keeping his voice even, "did Diane leave tonight?" She was quiet for a second. "She left before the truck," she said. "Before dark. She had a suitcase." Before dark. Before the truck. Diane Marsh had been gone for hours before the moving truck left, and nobody had seen it. And the question of where she'd gone was now a variable that nobody had accounted for. Boone was talking to Dell in low, urgent tones 7 feet away. Ridge heard enough, separate vehicle, unknown direction, hours ahead of us, to understand what it meant. Martin in the truck, 40 miles north, stalled at a rest stop. Diane gone, hours ahead, unknown direction. Avery here in Ridge's arms, on a dark gravel drive in front of a house that was being abandoned. Voss in his ear. "I'm filing in 40 minutes. Emergency placement protocol immediate. I need Avery's current location for the response team." He gave her the address. He heard her writing. "Medical personnel will be on site within 2 hours, Voss said. "Law enforcement will intercept Martin Marsh at the rest stop. We have enough on him right now, with what you sent, to hold him while the full investigation proceeds." Her voice was controlled and fast, and under the control there was something that had been waiting 14 months for this exact sentence. "You did it, Mercer. The package is solid." He said nothing. He looked at Avery's face against his shoulder. Her eyes were closed now, the exhaustion of a long night and a longer 11 months finally finding its opening. And he felt the weight of her, the real actual weight of a 5-year-old child who weighed next to nothing, which was also the weight of everything, which was also the weight of the word Ruby spoken in a cold garage by a man who had been carrying it for years. "Voss," he said. "Diane." "We're working it," she said. "She doesn't have Avery. That's what matters right now." "Find her," he said. "We will," Voss said. Boone ended his call and came back to Ridge and looked at Avery asleep against Ridge's shoulder with an expression that was not soft, exactly, but was the expression of a man who understands what he's looking at and what it cost and does not look away from either of those things. "Dell's staying on Martin," Boone said. "Law enforcement is 3 minutes out on 81. Ridge nodded. "Evelyn?" "On her way." The morning was beginning to arrive. Not light yet, but the quality of the dark changing, the absolute becoming gradual, the tree line separating itself from the sky by increments. Somewhere a bird stopped, started again. The cold was the same cold it had been all night, but it felt different now, or Ridge felt different in it. Not warmer, not less cold, but more present in it, more specifically located in the particular cold of this particular morning. Avery shifted in his arms without waking. She made a small sound that was not distress, the sound of something releasing, something that had been held tight for a very long time finding, in the dark, in the cold, against a scarred man's leather jacket, a reason to let go. Then Boone's phone lit up. He looked at it. He looked at Ridge. "Dell," he said, and his voice had changed, the compression in it different, the specific quality of a man receiving information that changes the shape of what he thought he was dealing with. He put the phone to his ear and listened for 8 seconds, and his face did something that Boone Garrett's face almost never did. "What?" Ridge said. Boone lowered the phone. "Martin Marsh isn't alone in the truck," he said. Ridge looked at him. "There's a child in the back," Boone said. "Dell can see her through the rear window. Small, dark hair." He looked at Ridge directly, with the full weight of everything they'd both read in that folder, everything Lyle had laid out on a plywood counter in a cold garage. "It's not Avery." The word Ruby came back, the word Petra, the word 4 names confirmed, possibly one before. The filing was going in. The team was 40 minutes out. Law enforcement was 3 minutes from Martin Marsh's truck on a rest stop on 81. And there was a child in the back of that truck that nobody had known about, that was not in the documentation, that had not come from the Marsh house. And the question of where she had come from, and how long she had been there, and what her name was expanded in the cold morning air, like something that was always there but had not yet been visible, and now could not be made invisible again. Ridge looked at Boone. Boone looked at Ridge. And the morning kept arriving, indifferent and absolute, And somewhere on a highway 40 miles north, a little girl with dark hair sat in the back of a moving truck, not knowing that in 3 minutes everything was going to change. The 3 minutes felt like a year. Ridge stood in the dark driveway with Avery asleep against his shoulder and listened to Boone on the phone with Dell and watched the eastern sky go from black to the particular gray that precedes color. And he thought about a dark-haired girl in the back of a moving truck 40 miles north, and he thought about Ruby, who had been 6, and he thought about the word unsubstantiated that had lived in his chest for 11 years, like a splinter too deep to reach. Then Boone said quietly, "They have him." Ridge exhaled. "Law enforcement stopped the truck," Boone said. He was listening to Dell and translating simultaneously, his voice low so it wouldn't wake the child against Ridge's shoulder. "Martin Marsh is in custody. They found the girl. Her name is Nora. She's 7. Dell says she's okay. She's scared, but she's okay." Nora. A name that wasn't in the documentation. A name that wasn't in any of Lyle's 14 months of files. A child who had been in that truck, hidden in the machinery of Martin Marsh's careful and practiced disappearing, and who was now sitting in the parking lot of a rest stop on Interstate 81, surrounded by law enforcement, and being okay in the specific, insufficient, beginning way that children start to be okay after a long time of not being. "Diane," Ridge said. "Still working it," Boone said. "Voss has 3 states looking." It took 4 more hours. Diane Marsh was found at 7:40 in the morning at a budget motel outside Staunton, checked in under her mother's maiden name with 2 suitcases and a burner phone, and the particular expression of a woman who had been running the calculations on her situation for longer than anyone knew and had finally found the edge of them. She was taken into custody without incident. She did not ask about Avery. She asked immediately and only for a lawyer. Ridge learned this from Carol Voss, who called at 7:52 while he was sitting in Evelyn's kitchen with his 3rd cup of coffee, and Avery asleep on Evelyn's couch under a quilt that had belonged to Evelyn's mother, the purple backpack still clutched against her chest, even in sleep, the frog boots still on her feet because she had refused to take them off, and nobody had argued. Voss's voice on the phone was the voice of someone at the end of something enormous, the controlled exhaustion of a person who has been running at capacity for 14 months and is now, for the first time, not running. "It's done," she said. "Nora," Ridge said. "She's being evaluated. She was with them 4 months. She came from—" Voss stopped. "That's going to take time to fully understand. There are people working it now." A pause. "She's alive. She's going to need a lot of support, but she's alive." Ridge looked at Evelyn across the kitchen table. Evelyn was looking at her coffee, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was receiving information that was both better and worse than everything simultaneously, when the outcome is the right one, and the cost of it is still fully present, and both of those things have to be held at the same time. "Avery," Voss said, "she's here. She's sleeping. The placement team will come this afternoon. Good people. I chose them specifically. A couple in Waynesboro. They've done this 14 times. They know trauma. They know patience." Voss paused. "She can take the backpack." "She won't leave it," Ridge said. "Good," Voss said. "That's good." A longer pause. "Mercer, what you built, the documentation, the clinical records, that's what made this unassailable. Martin Marsh's attorney is going to try everything. But what you gave me left no room at all." She said it quietly, with the specific weight of someone who has spent years fighting for room in cases that didn't have enough of it. "I'll be in touch about the process. It's going to take time, but it's moving, and it won't stop." She ended the call. Ridge set the phone on the table. He looked at his hands wrapped around the coffee mug, the grease-stained hands, the broken thumbnail, the knuckle scars. Evelyn was looking at him across the table and saying nothing, because there was nothing to say yet, and she understood that. Outside, through the kitchen window, the morning had fully arrived, gray but present. The pines standing in it, the creek audible below the wind, the particular quality of a morning that has come in behind a long night and asked nothing of you except that you be still in it for a moment. "She said it wouldn't stop," Ridge said. "No," Evelyn said. "It won't." He looked at the window. "Ruby, he said. Evelyn looked at her hands. We couldn't help Ruby, she said. We helped Avery. She looked up at him. We helped Nora. He nodded. He breathed. It was not enough, and it was what there was, and those two things would live together in him for the rest of his life. And he understood that, and he accepted it with the specific acceptance of a man who has learned the difference between resolution and peace, which is that resolution closes something, and peace is something you build slowly in the space that opens up after. Lyle came in the afternoon. He came alone, without Dell, without Boone, driving a truck Ridge hadn't seen before, and he sat at Evelyn's kitchen table and drank the coffee she put in front of him and didn't speak for the first 3 minutes. Ridge sat across from him. The house was quiet. Avery was still sleeping, had been sleeping for 6 hours with the depth of someone whose body was finally allowed to do what it had needed to do for a very long time. West Virginia confirmed this morning, Lyle said finally. They're reopening Ruby's case, the ME report, the original investigation, all of it. He looked at his coffee. The forensic investigator I told you about, in Charleston. She's been waiting for this. She's ready. Ridge said nothing. It won't bring her back, Lyle said. No, Ridge said, but it'll be on the record. What happened to her? Who was responsible? He looked up. That matters. It doesn't fix anything, but it matters. Lyle's hands on the table were still, and Ridge looked at them, large hands, working hands, the hands of a man who had spent 14 months doing something with no guarantee of outcome because a boy named Owen who lived with his niece had told her things that couldn't be unheard, and she had told Lyle, and Lyle had been unable to be the man who did nothing. Your niece, Ridge said. Owen. Lyle looked at him. Something moved in his face, not quite pain, but the cousin of it, the thing that happens when pain has been present long enough that it changes the landscape of an expression permanently. He's doing better, Lyle said. He's 11 now. He has a dog. He still has bad nights. He paused. He knows people tried. He knows people kept trying after he got out. His jaw tightened briefly. That matters to him. Knowing people didn't stop. Ridge nodded. They sat in Evelyn's kitchen in the afternoon light and drank her coffee and said almost nothing else, because there was almost nothing else to say, and sometimes the presence of another person who understands the full weight of what just happened is enough, is in fact the only thing that is enough, in the specific way that words are not. Avery woke up at 3 in the afternoon. She came into the kitchen in her yellow coat and frog boots with the purple backpack and her hair flattened on one side from the pillow, and she looked at the room, Ridge, Evelyn, Lyle, all of them at the table. And she did the scan, the rapid directional assessment, and then she apparently found what she was looking for because something in her small face settled. She climbed into the chair next to Ridge without asking. Evelyn put apple juice on the table. Avery drank it with both hands on the cup. Is Martin gone? She asked. Yes, Ridge said. She looked at the table. She thought about this. Is he coming back? No, Ridge said. She absorbed this with the gravity of someone for whom the answer has very large dimensions. She looked at her juice. She looked at Lyle, who she hadn't met before. He looked back at her with the steady patience of a man who understood exactly who she was and what she'd survived without needing her to explain it. Hi, she said to Lyle. Hi, Lyle said. She looked back at Ridge. I have my drawings, she said, touching the backpack. The ones I saved. I have yours too, he said. At the shop. She nodded slowly. The one with the wings? On the wall, he said. Center of the board. She looked at him with the gray-green eyes, doing all that work, running the full calculation one more time, and then, with the particular completeness of a child who has decided something, she leaned sideways and put her head against his arm and looked at the table and said nothing else. He didn't move. He sat with her weight against his arm and his coffee in front of him, and Evelyn across the table with her hands around her mug, and Lyle at the end of the table with his eyes at the window, and the afternoon light came through the glass, and the creek ran behind the house, and the pines stood in the cold, and the day held all of them in it, briefly, in the specific way that days sometimes hold the things they contain. Not gently, not easily, but completely. The placement team came at 4:30. They were a couple in their 50s, soft-spoken and unhurried, and they sat on Evelyn's couch and talked to Avery the way people talk when they're not performing talking. Just present, just asking simple things, letting her set the pace. Ridge watched from the kitchen doorway. Avery showed them one of her drawings from the backpack, a motorcycle, one of the recent ones, the exhaust pipe finally right. The woman said it was excellent, and meant it. And Avery looked at it critically and said the mirror was still a little wrong, and the woman said she thought it looked right to her, and Avery said thank you in the tone of someone who disagrees but is choosing graciousness. When it was time to go, Avery stood up and put the backpack on and looked at Ridge. He crouched down, eye level. She put one hand on his face, just briefly, the palm against his jaw, the small fingers light, and looked at him with the gray-green eyes, and she said, "You came back every Sunday." "Yes," he said. "You didn't have to." "No," he said. "I didn't." She looked at him for a long moment with everything she knew in her eyes, which was more than any 5-year-old should know, and which was also hers, completely, the knowledge she'd built out of the material her life had given her, and which nobody could take, and which would become, over time, the bones of something strong. "Okay," she said. She went with the couple to their car, her yellow coat bright in the gray afternoon, the purple backpack on her shoulders. At the car door, she turned around and looked back at the house, at Ridge in the doorway, at Evelyn behind him, at Lyle's truck in the drive. And she raised one hand, not a wave exactly, more like an acknowledgement, a signature. The car pulled out. Ridge watched it until it reached the road and turned south and was gone. He stood in the doorway for a long time after. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at the shop. No return address. Waynesboro postmark. He opened it at the workbench under the shop light, standing in his jacket because the heat hadn't come on yet, with a mug of terrible coffee in his other hand. Inside was a single sheet of construction paper. Red. A road. Long and straight, drawn with a ruler or the edge of a book, extending from one side of the paper to the other. Above the road, a sun. Large and careful, with rays that she'd drawn individually, each one a deliberate stroke. Below the sun, a motorcycle. The exhaust pipe was exactly right. The mirror was exactly right. Both of them, finally, exactly right. On the motorcycle, a figure in an angular leather jacket. Beside the road, standing in the grass she'd drawn in careful green strokes, a small figure with a purple backpack and frog boots, and her arms slightly out, like she was feeling the air, like she was standing in something open. Below it, in the uneven crayon letters he'd come to know, "Thank you for seeing me." He stood at the workbench for a long time. Then he took the drawing and pinned it at the center of the board, directly over everything else, because it was the end of the documentation and the beginning of something he didn't have a word for yet, something that wasn't hope exactly, but was made of the same material hope was made of, built from the same place in the chest. He finished his coffee. He put on his helmet. He pushed the shop door open, and the cold came in. And beyond the cold was the road. And beyond the road was the ridge going amber in the early light. And beyond the ridge was the sky, which was clearing after a long gray week, which was becoming something worth looking at. He started the bike. The engine turned over with the sound of old iron finding its rhythm, rough and full, and carrying in the cold air further than it should, down the gravel drive, out to the road, north toward the ridge. He rode without destination and without urgency, and the cold came at him the way it always had, and he let it, and this time it was just cold. Just the temperature of a November morning in Virginia. Just the air, doing what air does, moving through everything, over the ridge and down the other side, and out across the open land where the frost was burning off the fields in the first light. He rode until he couldn't see the shop in his mirror anymore. Then he rode further. The road opened up ahead of him, and the morning was clear, and the engine was loud in the way of things that are alive and don't apologize for it, and Ridge Mercer rode into the distance carrying old scars and 2 names he'd never stopped carrying, one for what he hadn't been in time to stop, and one for what he had. And the difference between those 2 names was the whole distance between who he'd been and who he was now, and it was not a small distance, and he had not crossed it easily, and it was the most important ground he'd ever covered. The motorcycle's shadow stretched long on the road ahead of him, going where he was going, wearing the same shape, carrying the same weight. Just lighter. Just slightly, irreversibly lighter. End.